short introduction. Okay, now I think we are also live in YouTube, and dear participants, again, welcome to Yıldız Technical University, Department of Economics in online, of course. Today we are going to welcome dear Professor Geoffrey Hudson. First, I will give a brief introduction about him, and after that I will leave the floor to him to listen, and also our participants are also coming. The number is increasing. So let me introduce him. Dear Professor Geoffrey Hudson, he's a professor in management at the London campus of Loughborough University. He has an education background in economics, mathematics, and philosophy, mostly at the University of Manchester and the University of Cambridge. And since 1960s, in fact, he had been at different institutions for teaching and research, such as University of Cambridge, University of Northumbria, University of Manchester, and I think finally University of Hertfordshire. And for now, as I said, he's at the London campus of Loughborough University. Professor Hudson mostly focuses on institutional economics and the history of economic thought. And his ongoing research is investigating the nature of property rights, markets, and corporations. And of course, he has a vast number of published books and articles. For example, with a relatively new ones, he's the winner of Schumpeter Prize 2014 with his book Conceptualizing Capitalism. And Professor Hudson was also one of the founders of the other canon, which is a center and network for heterodox economics research. Hudson is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Institutional Economics. And today, dear professor will be with us with the title of Capitalism, Socialism, and the Climate Crisis. So we are going to listen under this topic today. So dear participants, if you have questions, you can write them to the chat boxes in Zoom or in YouTube. I can direct them after the presentation, questions from YouTube. And of course, you can also ask them by raising your hands and turning your microphones on. You can ask your questions. So now I'm giving the floor to Professor Hudson. Dear Professor, we are listening to you. So I think, do you have share any presentation or something like that?
Yeah, yes, I'll share the presentation. Maybe it's a good idea that everybody turns their cameras off because I have low bandwidth and that will help. But thank you very much indeed for this kind invitation to talk on this topic. It's a great pleasure to do this, and and an honor for me. And I look forward to discussing the important issues surrounding climate change. I'll just now try and share my screen. And here we go. Hopefully you can see this okay. And I'll start the slideshow. Okay, so the title of my talk is Capitalism, Socialism, and the Climate Crisis. There's 7 sections, but some of these are fairly quick. I'm going to talk about capitalism, I'm going to talk about socialism, and I'm going to talk about how we deal with the climate problem, climate emergency. This talk is based on chapter 10 of my latest book, which came out a few months ago.
Dear Professor, sorry for interrupting, but now we can see the presentation if you had shared.
Yes.
We cannot see this.
You cannot see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Can you now? I shall try and do this again. Entire screen. Allow. Okay, this may be successful now. Can you see this now?
Yes, now we can see the PowerPoint page.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh, okay, good. I started. Right. So, as I was saying, my talk today is based on chapter 10 of my latest book, Liberal Solidarity, which came out earlier this year, where I discuss the climate crisis. In brief summary, what I'm going to do is tackle. There's two examples named here. One is Naomi Klein, quite famous, Ian Goff, a friend and colleague of mine. And they argue that the climate crisis is a serious problem, but actually it's endemic to capitalism, because capitalism is driven by greed and the profit motive. And this implies, in turn, a growth imperative. So growth is endemic to capitalism itself, according to their arguments. And growth is at the root of the problem with the climate crisis and the ruination of our natural environment. Similarly, ecological economists Clive Spash and Anthony Ryan, in their writings on economics and ecology, they call for a fundamental change in economic systems and distance themselves from those fundamentally committed to market capitalism. So we get slogans like this on demonstrations concerning climate change: system change, not climate change, which implies we need to change the system to deal with climate change, at least in some permanent sense. You're probably familiar with people arguing along these lines. Well, in rebuttal, my first point is that some capitalisms are much greener than others. There's a selection of important countries here, including the United States and the UK. Some of these countries are relatively underdeveloped, including Vietnam. Explain the columns. You've got the annual carbon dioxide emissions in tons per capita. So it's a measure of, on average, how much individuals on average are making activity which puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Of course, there's other pollutants as well, but we need further data on those. I'm going to simplify things by concentrating on carbon dioxide, which is a major greenhouse gas. Now, in the first column, the 1980 column, the ones in red are levels above 10. Okay, so it's this way of identifying the most serious culprits there, including Canada, Denmark, Finland, Germany, United Kingdom, United States. But this is 1980. This is 41 years ago. So if we look at the picture for 2018, fewer of these countries are above 10%, and there's some reductions, but we still have above 10% in 3 countries, namely Canada, South Korea, and the United States. And the final column on the right gives the changes. Red is for increases, blue is for middle range, and then green is for levels of reduction, which are much higher. So the blue ones are intermediate, the greens are the best performers, and the reds are the worst performers, with a big increase. No surprise about China, of course, but that's gone through enormous economic development, so we have to take that into account in the last 38 years between these two figures. The best performers are Denmark, Finland, and France, and Sweden and the United Kingdom. I'll come to that in a minute. By this metric, in other words, successful reduction of carbon dioxide emissions per capita in this 38-year period. I'll go into more detail in the book because I don't want to let the United Kingdom off the hook. Different countries have achieved this reduction in different ways. In the case of the United Kingdom especially, it's achieved this reduction by exporting manufacturing activity, not necessarily by design, but de facto relocation of manufacturing activity to other countries, including China, for example. So if you correct these figures to take into account exports and imports of manufactured and other goods, then you get a quite different picture. And the British performance, the UK performance, is not nearly so good. I'd make these amendments in the book, but my main point here is to simply point out that there's a huge variation in capitalism. So rather than overthrowing capitalism and trying to build socialism, if the problem is as urgent as we think it is, and I think it is urgent, we could first emulate other capitalisms. And the ones that come out best, even after compensating for the export of emission-producing activity, are the Nordic countries, particularly Denmark and Finland. So we have role leaders here. We have countries which are doing relatively well with these compensated figures, and they should be exemplars for us to follow their practice, rather than saying we must overthrow capitalism everywhere to deal with this problem. Let's deal with the logic of the argument about the capitalist growth imperative. I mean, the basic idea is found anyway in Marx. This is a quotation from Capital, where he talks about the pressure on the capitalist to constantly expand their activity. And you have the phrase, you accumulate, that's Moses and the prophets. Well, this is Marx, and he's actually identifying in a quite analytical way the dynamic of capitalist expansion. He was living in the 19th century, and he was witnessing a huge expansion in capitalism in Britain and elsewhere, and he wanted to understand the dynamic, and this explanation is part of that story. Okay. Now, I'm not going to criticize this. I think there's something in this argument, but what I'm going to say is that it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily follow from this story about individual capitalists that capitalism as a whole necessarily means expansion. It has done historically, but it doesn't necessarily mean it. There's a thing called the fallacy of composition, that is that wrongly assuming that an assumption which applies to individual elements in a system will apply to the system as a whole. Now, Marx doesn't discuss this, so I'm not criticizing Marx. What I am criticizing is people that says, well, look at Marx and accumulate. That implies capitalism necessarily as a whole has an unavoidable growth imperative. Now, that second step, that last step in the argument, ignores interactions and systematic outcomes. So, for example, if we have all capitalist firms expanding, we have to also take into account the interactions between them. They're going to be competing strongly among each other for markets, and some of them are going to go bankrupt. Well, bankruptcy rates, at least amongst small and medium firms, are quite high. In some periods, as much as 10% of small or medium enterprises fail per year. Okay, so there's a frequent culling of firms, which is based on, results from the the competition which is endemic to capitalism itself. So the fallacy of composition warns us that what occurs at the micro level doesn't necessarily occur at the macro level. And if we bring in systemic outcomes resulting from competition, for example, then we don't necessarily get the conclusion to which some people are driving. Let's look at some historic figures, 1820 to 1913. What I'm pointing out here is actually growth, even under dynamic periods during Marx's lifetime, is actually quite slow, or has been quite slow. We've got periods of faster growth, but I'm just talking about this period, this 93-year period first. UK GDP grew by an average of under 2% per annum. Now, almost half of that was due to population increases. So population rose, partly because living conditions improved gradually and so on. So if we take per capita growth, it was only just above 1% per annum, which is slow. And it's still maybe worrying ultimately about climate change, but we can't assume that capitalism has always rapid growth. Sometimes even in dynamic periods, like the 19th century, the growth has been quite low. The second problem with the argument of people like Naomi Klein and others is that profit-seeking is not unique to capitalism. The profit-seeking is thousands of years old. Profit-seeking is whenever you have an enterprise that is using monetary units, which is facing a markets and using money for exchange, and trying to maintain a balance on its, trying to ensure that its revenues exceed its costs and it remains solvent. And so we have profit-seeking in some sense in monetary or partly monetarized economies, at least since ancient Greece and Rome, probably earlier in China. So it's thousands of years old, and for most of this time there was very little growth, much less than even 1%. So the argument that profit-seeking necessarily means rapid growth is historically challenged. To deal with climate change, we need technological innovation. I mean, we also have to address other things as well. We need to dramatically change our consumption patterns. We need to reduce waste and so on and so forth. All those things are essential and they are urgent to deal with the problem. But we also need technological innovation. There are innovations going on which are reducing our climate impact dramatically. I mean, even in the last few years, we know that motor cars are a major problem, but the fuel consumption of motor cars, the fuel efficiency of motor cars has dramatically improved. It doesn't solve the problem. Car emissions are still a serious matter and a major contributor, but we have made dramatic strides in that direction. And there's many other examples of actual and imminent technological innovations which will help enormously to deal with climate change, including carbon capture technology and so on. So we need innovation. Now, what we know historically is that capitalism is by far the most innovative system in history. By capitalism, I mean the system which got established in Europe in the last 200 or 300 years, and then has spread globally in different forms and different varieties more recently than that. And capitalism is a hugely innovative system. So one of the upsides of capitalism is that it creates innovation through competition and so on. The downsides are that it has some micro-level growth imperative and so on. Every system has downsides. But do we get rid of the goose that lays the golden eggs? Do we get rid of capitalism, which is innovative, to substitute it for a system called socialism, which we have little evidence that would suggest that it's actually equally as innovative as capitalism can be. Another issue is population, and there's an extraordinary silence about this issue amongst climate change activists. I mean, I would regard myself as concerned about climate change, but I think the population is an issue. Well, I'll come up with an example here. This is an article I found by David Satterthwaite. And what he argues is that a significant proportion of the world's urban and rural populations have consumption levels that are so low that they contribute little or nothing to such emissions. It is misleading to see population growth as the driver of climate change. Well, that's right. Both bits of that quotation are correct. They're factually correct. But notice it's in the present tense. It is misleading to see population growth as a driver of climate change. And what would happen if the less developed countries in Africa or Asia or wherever were to begin developing more rapidly? So, well, then we're no longer in the present tense, we're in the future tense, and actually there would be a serious problem. Satterthwaite's argument basically means we need not tackle the issue of population growth as long as we can keep the world majority in poverty. As long as they oblige us by keeping poor, then we don't have to worry. We do have to worry if every country in the world is growing at 2% and growing in a way with current technology and current emissions rates. We would very quickly have to worry about that. The problem would be compounded by development in the third world, throughout the world. Now, I think development throughout the world is a good thing. I think poor countries should become richer. So I don't want to constrain the development of underdeveloped countries simply to deal with climate change. We have to deal with both problems. That is underdevelopment in the third world and climate change. So I think the population is an issue. So this raises the question, now, how do we deal with population? Well, we have the example of China's former one-child policy, which actually was introduced in the late 1970s after Mao's death. And one of the major inspirations, incidentally, was the Club of Rome report, which came out in the 70s, and worries about what might happen. So it was quite a prescient, far-seeking or policy introduced by the Chinese elite at that time. But we would worry about, I mean, China's now abandoned it for other reasons, but we would worry about imposing a China-style policy in other countries because it sounds awfully illiberal. That is, you're fining people or punishing people, couples for having more than one child, for example. So is there any hope of controlling population in a liberal and democratic society? We have to raise that question. Well, the crucial here is the work of Sen. And he argues that a crucial factor in the control of population growth is the empowerment of women, giving women more control over their lives and thereby control over their fertility. And the data for 2 Indian states, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, show that they've reduced fertility rates by such policies down to some rates like 1.7 children per couple, compared with 1.9 in China in particular periods. So there is a way forward to deal with population growth in a liberal and democratic and even emancipatory way for women particularly. So we should put the population issue side by side with the issue of economic growth. They're both important. The economic growth is an issue we have to address. We have to have sustainable economic growth. We also need a sustainable population. But that takes us away from this binary view that capitalism is bad and has to be replaced by socialism, because it tells us what the issue is much more complicated, and we have to take on board the population as well. So we don't, to deal with climate change, we have a wider agenda. Now let's talk about socialism now. In another book which I published 2 years ago called Is Socialism Feasible? I make a distinction between small and big socialism. Simple words. We don't have to define exactly what that means, but small socialism is things like worker cooperatives, typically placed on markets, and big socialism is state ownership, as we saw in the Soviet Union, as we saw in China under Mao, and so on. So small socialism requires markets, and therefore worker cooperatives, which are competing with each other, there's common ownership, but only at the firm level. They must make a surplus to survive, and otherwise they're simply subsidized by the state, and inefficiencies arise and so on. There may be a case for some subsidies in some cases, but generally they should be making some kind of surplus. So there's profit seeking. As long as we have markets, profit is an issue. So the objection to capitalism would also apply to small-scale socialism. So let's look at the other case of big socialism with nationalization and central planning. Now, a key inspiration here is János Kornai, who incidentally died a few weeks ago. and he wrote a classic book called The Socialist System. And he actually argues that there's a socialist growth imperative. So the argument is we should replace capitalism by socialism because capitalism has an inherent growth imperative. But according to Corner, and I'll explain why in a minute, there's also a growth imperative for socialism for several reasons. Now here's a quote, first of all, to take from his book: leaders are impelled to show that socialism is a superior system and to build up their economy for military defense. So because you have a revolutionary change, those that are leading that change to keep the support of the population have to demonstrate that they have successfully improved the economy. And this is a big impetus for growth, which is we found in China and the Soviet Union under Stalin and so on, a dash for growth for that reason. There's also a second reason, is that unless there's a simultaneous world revolution, world socialist revolution, what we're going to have is socialist revolutions in one part of the world and not another, and those socialist states are going to have to defend themselves against capitalists, aren't they? They always have had to. Russia had to defend itself against foreign armies. China had less of an immediate threat, but it was also worried about its defense. So they have to invest hugely in their economy for military defense. There's another reason for that a socialist growth imperative. There's a final point that Cornell makes, which is also very relevant. He says, for capitalists, that's in a capitalist system, expansion is an attraction, but also a big risk, because any loss caused by a faulty investment decision hits them in the pocket. So a capitalist who fails loses money. This is the curb that the classical socialist system removes. Under socialism, it's all centrally planned, at least under Big Socialism, and the individual enterprise manager doesn't suffer in the pocket those losses that may occur. I mean, they may lose incentives or whatever, but there's no necessary reason for it because the whole system is one system with one legal center, with one central organizing focus. And what happens at the micro level may be different from case to case. So actually, generally speaking, socialism has a greater growth imperative than capitalism. This is certainly the truth historically, and we have no reason to suggest that these arguments wouldn't apply in the future if this was attempted. Okay, another factor relating to socialism is that democracy and citizen rights are crucial for environmental policy. What evidence do we have for that? I mean, there's a couple of papers here. I'm quoting one, Fredrickson et al., 2005, Seth Binder and Neumeier. They both provide data that lobby groups and pressure groups, use of the press for publicity, popular demonstrations, all these things, boycotts, in societies where that is possible, there's greater likelihood of pollution control. Okay? And this is based on evidence. It's not just speculation. So democracy and citizens' rights, democracy in the sense of having a pluralist society and where pressure is put on politicians in various ways, including the possibility of them not receiving support and being ejected in an election, those kinds of mechanisms and pressures do have positive effects. And we find the lack of these, for example, in a place like China, which may be capitalist, but is certainly not a developed democracy. Another example here is from Lee and Rivani that argue that democracy helps reduce environmental degradation in a wider survey of the evidence. So effective environmental lobbying to deal with these problems requires democracy and some freedom of expression. And the major problem, which I've highlighted, is that large-scale socialism is incompatible with democracy. Now, I'd have to talk at length about that point if I wanted to make a complete case, but let's make a brief case. It's incompatible historically. We've never had a case of large-scale socialism being sustained with internal democracy. Didn't happen in China from the beginning. In Russia in 1917, they did have some other parties, but they closed down the Constituent Assembly or Duma pretty quickly. And within a year, all other parties had been banned, and it was a one-party dictatorship. And that's happening in other places like Venezuela, Cuba, all examples. We have no example of a successful, enduring relationship between large-scale socialism and democracy. Now, there's a literature on gives us good reasons why that's so. So it's not only empirically a fact, looking at history, it's also analytically arguable. The two are congenitally incompatible. The reason is that centralization of economic power in the hands of the state means a lack of countervailing power. If all economic power is in the hands of the state, then centers of countervailing power are limited. And democracy, according to several authors, depends on that balancing power in various forms, different centers of economic power, trade union, free trade unions, all these kind of things. And that's been mentioned by Galbraith, Barrington Moore, Douglas Northam, and several others. So if that argument, which takes different forms for the different authors, if the argument is correct, then there's a systemic reason within large-scale socialism why democracy cannot endure. Countervailing power requires a mixed economy with an extensive private sector. Now, I don't deny the need or possibility of a public sector as well. All economies have public sector areas. All economies in some way, in some sense, are mixed economies. Doesn't make them necessarily democracies, but that's a condition. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So you can point to mixed economies which are dictatorships. Yes, there's several, or at least historically, and China would be an example now, which is a totalitarian system politically, but is a mixed economy. So these conditions are necessary but not sufficient. So that means if you remove the conditions, if you go away from a mixed economy and you have a state-run economy, you will undermine the likelihood of democracy. Okay, that's a very short treatment of a very complex issue. But anyway, the argument there suggests that with large-scale socialism, there will be difficulty in having the open democracy and freedom of speech, which is required to actually keep popular pressure to deal with pollution and problems of climate change. So to sum up, first of all, we need the innovative capacity of capitalism because it's necessary to deal with climate change. And scrapping capitalism or overthrowing capitalism would endanger that innovative capacity. You can argue that socialism can be innovative too, but that's speculation. It's not proven. It's irresponsible to suggest that urgent problem of climate change needs socialism. I emphasize the word irresponsible because it's diverting attention from the immediate and urgent changes that are needed within the existing system to deal with climate change. Consequently, the urgent task is to decarbonize capitalism as quickly as possible. Even if socialism follows or whatever, we have to act within terms of the existing system. And diverting attention from that is actually, I would say, irresponsible. Effective environmental policies rely on countervailing power, lobby groups, and some kind of representative democracy. So basically, our strategy should be to regulate and reform democratic capitalism, learning from those countries which are better in dealing with emissions overall than others, to deal with major problems, including inequality and the climate crisis, rather than trying to abolish capitalism entirely. Effective environmental policies rely on countervailing power, lobby groups, and democracy. I repeat an earlier point. these are incompatible with large-scale socialism. Okay, this is my last slide. Remember, I put a picture up of highly polluting power system, power generation unit, and I sort of hinted, I didn't say so explicitly, that this was a problem of capitalism. The picture was actually taken in the socialist DDR, East Germany, in the 1970s, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I played a little trick on you there. But thank you very much for listening. I very much look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we are waiting for your questions or comments, of course. If you have questions, so you can ask them. So
thank you very much, Professor Hudson, for this interesting talk. So my question was basically on, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to making policies concerning environmental policies, climate change policies. There's even these issues about climate clubs. No one is really coming together to agree on one single goal. So I was wondering, what would be the best way to move forward in terms of picking environmental policies or climate policies? Given your experience with this, the historical background, maybe you can have enlighten us on this matter. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a really big, it's a vital question. How do we move forward? Of course, you're absolutely right. The whole thing is extremely complex. I mean, the climate system is a complex system, and we can predict climate better than we can predict, much better than we can predict economics, because economies are even more complex than climates. They're nonlinear systems. They have strong feedback effects. There's a lot of uncertainties. I'll take an example. In my country, United Kingdom, we're not sure, and scientists still can't tell us, whether global warming will make the UK colder or warmer or wetter or drier. Okay, so we simply do not know. I mean, we could the Gulf Stream effect, the Atlantic conveyor could break down, which would make the UK more like northern Canada. Okay, so all sorts of things can happen. We simply do not know. So I mean, prediction in this sense is difficult, and it's also difficult when we come to the question of economic policy. And here, really, I have a lot of uncertainty myself. I'm not involved in the process of developing policy, but I think that first of all, there's a big role for national as well as international governments. We all know that the problem of dealing with getting agreement amongst international governments. We had a recent climate congress at Glasgow, which kind of mixed reports on what kind of success it got, but that we must actually keep momentum up independently of what's decided at the international level, independently of whether China joins in, or whether Russia joins in, or these other countries, or whether the US has got a progressive or a less progressive president. Every country and every bloc or league of countries has to do something right away. And I think this means, first of all, giving incentives for technological innovation would deal with the problem. There's first of all tax devices we can use, like a carbon tax has been tried. Maybe that's still worth working with. Incentives for people to reduce their energy consumption. Incentives for people to move to electric cars. Identify the big sources of emissions and give incentives for people to change behavior. To some extent, a lot of that's happening. I mean, electric cars are already come across the horizon. And probably the next car I shall buy will be electric, not hybrid, electric. And this may be within the next 5 years or so. And I think that's true for many people in developed countries will be shifting over. And that will actually have a cumulative effect on innovation, improved batteries, more power sources people can plug into. All those things have network effects, and that's also very important. Again, there's an important role for government in promoting that. To some degrees, countries are doing that already. So I think we need a whole array of policies, and we have to get away from the idea that we either have to wait for all governments to agree or wait for some system change, socialism, until we can deal with it. We have to deal with it here and now in our own behavior, in regional behavior, national behavior, at every level. Thanks for your question.
So there's a question from Ercan Eren in the chat box. I think you can also see.
Maybe I just turn it on. Sure.
In the chat box.
Professor Khan was raising his hand.
Yeah.
Yes. Also
okay, just read
it. Yes, I saw that now, Professor Khan.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. I mean, you're asking about my use of the word liberalism. I've actually been sympathetic to liberalism for decades rather than recent years. Yeah, and the question is, what's the relation to what I'm proposing to James Mead's liberal socialism? Rawls is property owning democracy, and Piketty's participatory socialism. Well, that's a brief comment on all of them. I'm inspired by all three authors. I knew Mead personally. His liberal socialism is my small socialism, my small socialism. And I like other liberals, like John Stuart Mill. I'm very much an advocate of experimenting with worker cooperatives. So also with other forms, which are not necessarily cooperative. So we should experiment with different corporate forms, including worker cooperatives and including more conventional capitalist style firms and participatory capitalist style firms and so on and so forth. And that experimentation should help us work out what kind of forms work best and what should be developed further. So in those terms, I'm very sympathetic to Mead's arguments. Rawls's property owning democracy is also, Rawls's work is also inspiring. I think that one of the criticisms I make of Rawls's work, I don't want to underestimate his positive contribution, but one of the criticisms I make is actually a lot of his arguments are too consequentialist, I think. I think we need to focus not simply on individual behavior in terms of consequences, but individual behavior in terms of motivation. So I would perhaps emphasize more strongly than Rawls does the importance of things like moral commitment and moral motivation. That's why in a political system, governments that lie, governments that cheat, governments that just line the pockets of government ministers and so on, this kind of immoral behavior that we've seen in many countries, including mine, in recent years, is actually undermining the solidarity and moral commitment that we all require to deal with this problem. Because this problem is not just for us, it's a problem for future generations. So our children and grandchildren and children and grandchildren of other people that are important. So it's not just our individual comfort or welfare or utility that matters, it's those other people in the future that matter too. And I think that means that we have to emphasize moral commitment a little more. Piketty's participatory socialism is a, well, I like Piketty's work. I mean, his book on capitalism in the 21st century is a classic. It's a major, largely empirical, but very powerful expose of inequality, which is another major problem in modern societies. I disagree with his use of the word socialism. What he's proposing is not socialism, in my view. My view, what socialism means is the definition of socialism we get if you get a dictionary. If you get the Cambridge Dictionary or the Oxford Dictionary or the Merriam-Webster dictionary and look up the word socialism, it means mostly or almost entirely common ownership of the means of the production, which can be state ownership or it can be cooperative ownership. Now, if socialism means that, that's not what Piketty is proposing. See, Piketty's, the French environment, the French politics is polarized between the left and the right, and there's very little center ground in France. So Piketty chooses words to play to the left rather than the liberal words, which I think in the Anglo-American context we can use more usefully. So what the substance is saying, I agree with, but I think the labeling is a problem.
Okay, thank you. I see dear Ali Khan raising hand. I'm giving the floor to me, and after that, I see also Mehmet Ustay. Dear Khan, we are listening to you.
Thank you, Professor Tugral. I will follow up Professor Aaron's question in the chat and say with him that I too have been following Professor Hodgson's work for some time with great admiration, and I have also, I think I have a review of one of his anthologies. I'm not sure, I will check. And I think he and I belong to the same generation. I was an LSC undergraduate 1966-69, and I was there in particular in 1968. And so I too, I grew up on Mead. And Partha Das Gupta, who was Mead's son-in-law, is my contemporary. So my question, this is a wonderful talk and I took notes, and I hope, and this is where this whole forum is so grand for me, because it puts us into conversation and hopefully email exchanges and so on. But my question to you will strike you a little bit idiosyncratic and rooted in the environment in which I am functioning. So you and I suppose all the people who have been hearing you, we are on the same page about this existential crisis. And the words that you use are words which I used as an undergraduate. These are the words of 1968. And I want to put to you in a soft voice that in terms of the objectives, those words to me become somewhat an impediment for the American context. Americans are frightened by liberalism. They are freedom-loving people, brave and freedom-loving people. And they are frightened by the word liberalism and then socialism on top of it, although Bernie Sanders has done a lot to puncture that balloon, but still. And the second context is my own profession, the economics profession. And I think the economics profession, if you will forgive me for saying so, has done a lot of damage to the public square in terms of offering words of efficiency and banning certain words. You talked of the use of Piketty's words, but the profession's words, you know, and after all, we still teach, believe it or not, we still teach the three fundamental theorems of welfare economics in our curricular courses. I mean, you look at David Krebs's book and you look at Mascolel, Winston Green. I mean, we are still doing the same old, and we preen our feathers and take great posturing pride over this. So I am inclined to suggest that for these two contexts, this American context and the economics profession context, both two big elephants in the room, one in the room of the world and the other in the room of the social sciences. Can we approach it from some oblique, tangential angle so we could be more effective? Can we, rather than use these words, which are honest, transparent words, as befits a great scholar that you are, can we use things like, okay, let's talk about theory. Where are you going? There is the Koopman's whining controversy. There is Frank Knight. You have now preempted Knightian uncertainty, but that's not what Knight was talking about. Please look at the Lucas critique again from Keynesian point of view, etc., etc. Shall we be more tactical? There's the question.
I think you've raised a number of great issues there. I mean, we should, as you say about your own history, we are roughly contemporaries. And I remember I was an undergraduate between 65 and 68. So I was part of all that 68 stuff. Let's quickly move from that to the question of language and the use of the word liberalism. Now, liberalism means different things in different contexts. If I stood up in 1968 at a meeting at the LSE and said, I am a liberal, right? Some of my friends were liberals, I would get booed.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I get booed because liberal was a kind of wishy-washy, middle of the road kind of thing. And we don't do that, okay? So hence my reluctance to describe myself as a liberal, at least until 20 years ago or so on. Liberalism means different things, but it is a broad church, and it includes, even in the United States, some people I would say are more like libertarians. I'll give you an example. My friend Deirdre McCloskey. Deirdre McCloskey wrote a book promoting liberalism. Now, her version of liberalism, she's writing in the US, she's as American as anyone. She's writing in the US and she's promoting a liberalism which is very individualistic. It doesn't talk about cooperation of solidarity, but it does have a more sophisticated view of the agent. She talks about morality, which is very good, and I give her a big tick for that. But she's basically very much on the libertarian end of things. So I don't know her attitude to mask wearing in the pandemic, but I would guess she's probably hostile to the idea of people wearing masks. I think this is a key marker. I think in public places, we should wear masks in the pandemic because of the risk to others. And I use that at the beginning of my book to illustrate differences within liberalism. Our freedom does not give us the right to infect others with the virus, okay? It's a harm principle. John Stuart Mill. I think John Stuart Mill is closer to my thinking on this question than many American libertarians. Now, there's also liberal in the American context, which sort of goes redder and redder and gets towards socialism. For example, John Dewey, the famous American philosopher, from about 1930 described himself as a socialist. And I think his reasoning for doing this is actually quite faulty. I'm a great admirer of John Dewey, but I think his reasons, he talks about shared knowledge and all these things. He ignores the problem of tacit knowledge. I think are really quite suspect. And the trouble is the Democratic Party mixes both elements. You've got Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist, and you have other liberals, which are closer to me, liberal solidarity, sort of welfare state or social democratic liberals, which prevail in the Democratic Party alongside socialists. So all the Republicans go mad and say, you're all socialists, okay? And I think they have to sort that problem out. We have to say there's socialism and there's liberalism. And for me, the decisive thing is that the defense of individual liberty is much more important than whether you nationalize the post office or not, okay? Or whether you nationalize the energy companies. I mean, we might want to nationalize the energy, but that's secondary. Nationalization of something is secondary to individual rights, individual freedom of expression, and individual means to cooperate willingly with others, okay? All those things are the most vital. So here I'm with Amartya Sen, is that human development is really about the expansion of liberal capabilities. Liberalism or liberty being understood as developmental, the capacity to develop ourselves through freedom and through cooperation with others is vital and central. And that's why I think liberalism is a better label, and it's a more modern label than socialism. And that's why I use it and promote it. So I use it in conjunction with liberal solidarity or social democratic liberalism. So now that contrasts with the use of liberalism in continental Europe, because many liberal parties in continental Europe are more towards the free market, individualist, libertarian side of the argument than others. So everything's got its problems, everything's got its disadvantages, but I think that I made, on balance, a case for using the word liberalism. So, I mean, you raised a number of questions. That's a partial answer, but perhaps I should stop there.
I hear you. Thank you very much.
And Dirostai, are you hearing?
Thank you, Professor Hudson. I'm echoing other colleagues. I do follow your work as well, and I enjoy. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning of your lecture as I was at a class. But my question, again, perhaps a bit more existential, and the system responds to the issues. How convinced are you that within the existing system, by only looking at the behavioral norm and changing the behavioral norms, such as being more concerned about electricity and environment, we would be able to bring some solution while there are huge macro problem or structural problem that lies in front of us? In other words, I mean, I'm very much surprised to see that all the financial companies immediately have become very green, very climate, and they're trying to tell us that they are good guys. But at the end of the day, they are now commodifying the whole process as well, carbon trading and etc. So therefore, how, without tackling the initial equation, that it is very much the capital and capital interest and capital domination as the essential determining factor here. By looking at the behavioral norms, by the way, those behavioral norms are very much shaped by the same results as well, because we are encouraged with the financial system, financialization, to buy more, to make it easier for us to buy more. Perhaps just the behavioral norm change issue is not necessarily a solution here, but the initial equation. How are we going to tackle the initial equation, which is determined, of course, by capital interest? I understand your last photograph, the socialism, perhaps not necessarily the answer either, but at least it wasn't in favor of just one particular class, that was capital. How do we tackle that? I mean, institutionally, structurally? I would love to hear from you. Thank you, and hope to meet you sometime.
Yeah, me too. I hope to meet you too. And thanks for a great question. I think you're hitting the nail on the head, as we say in English. I think we do need structural change in the system, as well as looking at behavioral norms. I mean, the behavioral norms are something which we can tackle immediately, or at least not easily, but we can address them fairly quickly, like recycling rubbish and so on. But we do, I entirely agree with you, need structural change as well, including to the financial system. And your point about shareholder value and these other changes which have occurred in the corporate world, one could argue that they've been damaging to that mission as well. And we need to look at forms of regulation and financial restructuring which are much more environmental friendly. And I agree, we can be suspicious of the fact that corporations all say they clean themselves up. It's good they're making an effort and maybe they have achieved something important, but you know, that on its own is not enough. We need tougher regulation and more intelligent regulation to deal with these problems. And we should reverse the shareholder value movement with corporations, which simply maximizes the shareholder net wealth and doesn't look at social responsibility. That change in corporate law, that change in corporate attitudes, has occurred only in the last 50 years since Milton Friedman pressed it in the 1970s, and there's a big debate about that. A lot of people are saying we need to reverse that, and that's very important for the issue of climate change, amongst other things. So what we're looking at, what's needed structurally, is in capitalism, it's a change equivalent to the inauguration of welfare states. Okay, different countries have welfare states to different degrees. The most well-developed welfare states are in the Nordic countries, and where people tolerate quite high levels of taxation on incomes to sustain a welfare system which cares for their health, cares for their employment, and so on and so forth. And by all the indicators, does that very effectively. In my country, a welfare state started in 1906 on a low level, and then was built up, accelerated with the Labour government of the 1940s, 45-51 government. And this was a huge change within capitalism. It means that when welfare states have got established, things become difficult to reverse. We have the National Health Service, which is being changed in structural terms, but it's so popular that even the most free market conservatives cannot reverse it. They can't try and do it. So you have irreversibilities or ratchet effects occurring once welfare states get established. And we need to do something similar on a similar scale with capitalism to deal with central problems like climate change, and also I would add inequality. And not to make everyone equal, but to narrow the huge gap between rich and poor in terms of incomes and wealth. Now that's a very, very, very big agenda, and I'm not saying it's small or easy, but we need to do it, and we have examples amongst countries which have got a lot further in that direction than others, and we should all learn from those more successful countries in that regard. So thanks again for a great question.
I don't want to drag on, but just quickly, again, those regulations that we are referring to is very much dominated by the capital logic. So therefore, how much impact we can create. On the other hand, I mean, we are neighbors. I live in Leicester, by the way,
Right.
University, and also looking at the UK welfare system since 1980s, how it became distributive in the sense of not necessarily democratizing the society, but perhaps a coalition of keeping people happy as long as they do not interfere with the system, as we have seen with the Brexit, for instance. Most population who benefits from welfare state, they voted for Brexit because the ruling elite, one way or another, established that coalition. And therefore, perhaps that welfare state doesn't give the confidence. I'm not against welfare state, I fully support, but the political manipulation of that sphere is also a concern. I mean, just a reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, so I also see dear Burak Ünveren raising hand. And also there's another question in YouTube chat. I will copy and paste them to the chat box, but now we are listening, dear Ünveren.
So mine is not exactly a question, but rather a critical comment, I would say. I must say that I'm quite surprised by Professor Hudson's approach to the innovative nature of capitalism, because you take the innovative nature of capitalism as a given fact, but even so, for example, now we are communicating almost instantly, despite huge distances between us, and this is due to a very fundamental technology, right? Digital technologies, computers, and the internet, and these are all fruits of centrally planned, tax-funded government projects. And these notions are essentially inconsistent with the basic premises of free market system: taxes, government projects, and central planning. So if you look at the general historical trend, we also see that the contribution of governments in technology and innovation is getting bigger and bigger. I will just give another example. You mentioned electric cars. That technology wouldn't exist if the US government didn't give $5 billion, not million, $1 billion to Tesla, just free money. Because what's happening there? Because public opinion and the political will wants clean energy and new technologies, green technologies. So we subsidize and incentivize the technologies that we want, not the market wants. These are not the things that the market wants. These are the things that we want as the public, as the society. So I think the role of government, central planning, and tax-funded research should not be downplayed. And my impression from your talk was that you seem to minimize those aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that point. I think that's very important. Appreciate that. I mean, you're right. You give me an opportunity to expand on what one might think about in terms of innovation. You're absolutely right that a great number of innovations that we find in modern capitalism, and you gave an example, originate from a partnerships between the private sector and the state. Some come simply from the state or state research agencies, but very often there's a kind of partnership arrangement. There's some stimulus, which may come from the defense sector or something like that, which spills over into the private sector, and the private sector takes on. But what your general point is absolutely right, that within capitalism, the state plays a crucial role, and that includes the stimulation of investment. Okay, now this is generally true. In my conception of capitalism, you see my book, Conceptualizing Capitalism, where I explain this in more detail. The state is essential, not just for innovation, it's for markets, for property rights, for the financial system, and so on. Every part of the system relies in some way on the state. And there's different ways in which the state can interface between itself and other agencies. And this leads to the possibility and the actuality of different kinds of capitalist systems. So we have multiple capitalisms depending on the way in which these interact. Okay, and I fully agree with you that the state should be involved in subsidizing, improving, leading, helping, providing taxes for things like the development of electric car technology, smart power units, better ways of transportation which don't pollute or lead to so many emissions and so on. The state's role here is vital, okay? But the point I'm making is that the state alone cannot do it. Every case we've got of the state taking it all over has been disastrous in terms of innovative capacity. The innovative capacity of capitalism depends on an interaction or interface between the state and a private sector. If you get rid of the private sector, you have state socialism, as in China under Mao, as in the Soviet Union under Stalin and others, and they don't innovate. The innovation rates are very low. They can pour money into something like the Sputnik satellite, but it's quickly overtaken by technologies elsewhere in the US or whatever. This is well documented. The innovation rate of state socialism is relatively low. In fact, it's one of the worst features of their system is the low innovative rates. They're actually better at doing other things, allocating resources, dealing with poverty and so on, than some capitalist systems are. But innovation, they're very poor. So we need to learn from experience, which tells us that both the private sector and the state are required to generate innovation. And that's the model, a mixed economy model, because on my slides I talked about a mixed economy is necessary to deal with the climate crisis.
Thank you. Again, thank you very much. I think there's no another question. And dear Hudson, thank you very much. And also dear our guests, dear participants, thank you very much for your questions, for your participants. It was really a good seminar, I guess. So, and also again, I thank, so for example, dear Professor Ali Khan, dear Astay, dear Eren, I thank you very much for your comments, for your questions, and our departmental seminars will also continue in next week. We are waiting you also. We will continue with dear Spence in next week. And thank you very much again, Fazıl Hocam. I think we can end the session and hope to see you at next week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.